Hello, and welcome to this virtual series from the John Carter Brown Library. I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian here at the JCB. And this virtual series features about a dozen scholars talking about issues focused on the broad era of the American Revolution, giving us a kind of bird's eye view of big picture things and also a taste of their own research, the kind of worm's eye view. I'm really excited about the group that we have gathered to do this. This is part of the JCB's initiative around history and journalism, thinking about in this year when the revolution is news, how we can help support folks who are thinking and writing and speaking about the American Revolution by additional resources to help them think about these particular topics. And today I am totally delighted to introduce for the fourth installment of this series, the wonderful Kathleen Duval. Dr. Duval is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she specializes in early American and Native American history. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, love saying that, and a Guggenheim Fellow. She is this year at the National Humanities Center. She has also been a postdoctoral fellow from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. She won, I love this. There's so many things you could say about Kathleen, but I like this one. She won the 2008 Best Article Award from the William & Mary Quarterly. Of all the things, I'm going to emphasize that. And she's an elected fellow of the American Antiquarian Society and the Society of American Historians. Kathleen is the author of, among other things, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, and Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Duval. Thank you, Kathleen, for being here.
Thank you very much, Karin. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen and I've got some images to show. Should come on pretty soon if it's not there already. So I'm going to be talking about Native nations and the American Revolution. So I just wanted to start with what I think is the most important thing to know for understanding Native American history, or the Native present. And that is that Native Americans live in nations. To be a Native American today or in the past, one is a citizen or member of a tribe, a Native nation. That is the central definition of what it means to be Native. Plus, there may be US citizens and other sorts of identities, but that's at least one of the things that Native Americans are. That's what it means. And so that's one of the reasons on this first slide, I'm showing this picture from the protests against the pipeline in the Dakotas in 2016, which shows flags of different Native nations, which I think sort of represent this idea that in the past and today, Native people are members of individual Native nations. I've also got a couple of maps there, and those are from the 18th century, so from the era of the American Revolution, more or less. So, for example, that one at the top was originally made in 1757. It's used for many decades after that, but it's made in 1757. It's a French map. And if you look at that map, kind of what's in the biggest font in French, obviously it's a French map, are colonial names, names that Europeans called things. So right across the middle of the country, you see Louisiane, right? That's the giant colony that the French claim as Louisiana. You can see Florida and Georgia marked on there. Kind of some of the British colonies are cut off, but those big, there's Nouveau Mexique, right? New Mexico in the west. But then I'm going to show sort of a closer up version of this because I think it makes a really important point for our purposes here. This is the same map, just zoomed in a little bit so it's a little easier to read those names that are kind of 1 and 2 fonts smaller than those colonial names. And this map shows that even when a European made a map in the 1750s, in the 18th century, they are very aware of who actually lives on and controls almost all of the continent of North America, and that is Native people. So again, these are written in French. You would see the same in a British map, but just they're usually aren't as accurate of the middle of the country because they haven't done as much exploration there. But you can see sometimes you have to say these out loud to make them translate kind of into the words we know today. But you can see the Cherokees there, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws. And if you look at that sort of biggest circle to the west, this is maybe my favorite. In French, it says these countries and these savage nations, these native nations, are not well known, poorly known, right? So the map maker recognizes there are many more nations, especially there on the plains, that aren't even marked on that map. So I showed that just to show how important and how prominent and powerful Native nations are across the continent in the 18th century. Um, so this is a contemporary map from a textbook, but makes some ways the same point. I'll sort of use it to ground ourselves in the geography as we go forward. Um, I would say if we sort of talk about Native Americans and the American Revolution at the most basic, what I would say is that Native peoples found themselves in three different kinds of situations at the time of the American Revolution. This is overly simplified, but just to simplify things so that we sort of get a grounding in a variety of experiences. One were those kinds of nations, communities that were surrounded by or even integrated into the British colonies. Those are the ones along the East Coast, including that pull-out rectangle that's there with Stockbridge and others that are just showing how many different Native communities, Native nations there are in New England, for example, but also down the map, the Pamunkey in Virginia and the Catawba in South Carolina. Those are peoples who they have still strong Native identities and communities, and in fact still do today. So certainly did in the 18th century, but they also tended to have business ties and church ties and family ties with colonists, with British colonists in this case around them. And those people, not all of them, but those people, to generalize, at the time of the American Revolution are going to be more likely to be on the side of the revolutionaries. Those are their neighbors. They go to church with them. They might be intermarried with them, do business with them. They're going to have some of the same concerns about overreach by Parliament, for example. So that's one situation. A second situation are the still very powerful independent Native nations right on the border of the British colonies. So you can see those on the map, starting with the Mohawks there at the north. The Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas are all part of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Going down into the Ohio Valley, you can see the Delaware and the Wyandot, the Shawnee. And then into the south, you can see Cherokee, Chickasaw, Muskogee, that's Muskogee Creek, Choctaw. They are on the border of the British colonies, and particularly of those British colonies that are going to rebel in the American Revolution. These Native nations are starting to see illegal settlers coming onto their land, coming across the Appalachian Mountains onto their land illegally. And for that reason, they are going to be more likely to be on the other side of the American Revolution, on the British side, because the people they're going to identify as the enemy, as the threat, are going to be the settlers coming from the British colonists who also tend to be on the side of the American Revolution. But those Native nations completely set their own foreign policies. So the stories are more complicated than that sort of general view. Now, the main reason they are going to be more likely to be on the British side is the Proclamation of 1763. In 1763, the British government, in order to keep peace on the frontier, has issued a proclamation that creates a line, more or less. This is just my scribbly sketch line, but basically follows the Appalachian Mountains. And in 1763 declares that more or less settlers need to stay on the east side of that line, and everything west of that line, even though the British still consider those lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to be British, that settlement settlement or speculation on those lands is not allowed unless approved by the crown. So basically that those lands are to be reserved and recognized as under native sovereignty within the British Empire. So the British government sends 10,000 British soldiers or so to patrol that line, and indeed sometimes does remove settlers who cross that line illegally into native territory. So the proclamation line, as I said, makes Native nations on the border of the British colonies more likely to side with the British against the rebels in this revolution that happens next. It is also, this proclamation line is also one of the reasons that some settlers begin to turn against the empire, because they feel that in proclaiming and creating this line in 1763, the Crown has sided with Indians, as they would put it, against their own people, against British people, British colonists. And the reason that land, one reason that that land is so desired by speculators and settlers on the east side of that line by British colonists, is that the British colonial population is doubling every 20, 25 years or so. Every generation, the British colonial population is doubling. And they're mostly a nation of farmers at this point. And so they feel that every generation they need twice as much land or so as they had the generation before. That creates conflict in the American Revolution and obviously for many generations to come on the continent. And then the third situation, I just want to mention, I'm not going to be talking about much today, but it's all of those native nations to the west of there. So basically the western 2/3 of the continent, right along the Mississippi River, across the west to the plains and to the Pacific coast. They don't really care about the revolution. So I won't be talking about that much, but I just want to make that point here. All right, so if we were to talk some more about native nations on the colony's borders, basically we're talking about between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. The American Revolution for many of these peoples becomes a fight for their own nation's independence. So seeing them as nations and seeing that one of their objectives as protecting their own national independence is both really important for understanding what they do and an important parallel with the creation of the United States at the time of the American Revolution. Now, none of this means, though, that they will necessarily want to risk their lives in this fight. Some of their diplomats will say it's very dangerous to get involved in a fight between a father and his children, between British king and his colonists. That is not what we want to do. And so many of them, at the beginning at least, want to stay out of this war. Maybe hope that the British crown can pull these colonists back in line, right? Literally right behind the proclamation line, among other things, but don't necessarily want to fight. And they also, when it comes down to it, don't particularly want to fight the way British policymakers and military officers will want them to fight. It'll happen over and over in the American Revolution. British military officers will want their native allies to show up to a battle and fight in exactly the ways and exactly the times and the places that the officers want them to fight. Whereas for native people, these native nations on the border of the colonies, they want to attack illegal settlements. They have very little interest in showing up to big battles that Britain wants them to fight in, either against colonists or when the war expands and Britain is also fighting France and Spain, to fight against France or Spain, which they have no interest in making an enemy of. So let me give you just a few examples. I'll start with the Cherokee Nation. Sorry, I may have blocked out the title of the slide. I should say Native Nations on the Colony's Borders, the Cherokee Nation in this case. No, actually, this one does. So Cherokee Nation is one of these nations on the border of the British colonies, having problems with settlers. So despite the proclamation line, British settlers from North Carolina and Virginia had been coming into, not necessarily right around Cherokee towns. That's something that Georgia will do later in the 19th century. But in this period, it's mostly going on to and settling on Cherokee hunting lands. These are shared hunting lands that the Cherokees share with others in what's now mostly Kentucky. Kentucky actually it's a Haudenosaunee word, it's an Iroquoian word that means something like meadow, right? Kentucky is a place that is a shared hunting ground in the 18th century. So into Kentucky and into Tennessee. Cherokees complained that they could, as one put it, see the smoke of the Virginians from our doors. Now, at the same time, settler pressure, so that's people coming into Tennessee and Kentucky, these shared hunting lands. At the same time, there was settler pressure on some southern Cherokee lands coming in from South Carolina and Georgia. And so Cherokees are sort of debating what to do about this and whether they should take advantage of this brewing rebellion and possible crown crackdown to maybe fight back against these illegal settlements. And then in 1776, there in the Ohio Valley, there is an Ohio Valley Confederacy reforming. It had fought in Pontiac's War, part of the reason for the proclamation of 1763. But I'll talk about it more in a moment. But basically, this Ohio Valley Confederacy is reforming and talking about fighting against illegal settlements. So in 1776, a delegation of Shawnees and Delawares from the Ohio Valley and Mohawks from the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, they come to the Cherokee town of Chota. And actually, I'm just going to step back for a moment and introduce these two terms, autonym and exonym, because I've been using a lot of tribal names here. And I think the Haudenosaunee are a particularly useful place to use this. Autonym is a name that a people uses for themselves. Exonym is a name that other people put on that people. And so most Native nations have at least one of each. Now, an exonym isn't necessarily bad. It just isn't sometimes it's bad, right? But it isn't necessarily bad, but it is just not in it's often not in the people's own language. It's in the language of another people, not necessarily European people, perhaps another native people, and not the same necessarily as the name they have always called themselves. Sometimes peoples have taken on those exonyms. So Haudenosaunee is autonym. It means people of the Longhouse. Iroquois is an exonym. Okay, so this delegation shows up at the Cherokee town of Chota in May of 1776. They're dressed all in black. They're carrying a war belt. They describe how they made their journey through Tennessee and Kentucky, through lands that used to be, still are to some extent, shared hunting lands. And as one of the diplomats puts it, now the country is thickly inhabited by colonists and the people are all in arms. They say basically, let's take our chance now during this rebellion and join together against the colonists. Now, the Cherokee leaders were wary of this. They had gotten involved in the 7 Years' War. They'd fought on the side of the French. They had suffered devastation and disease. But a younger warrior named Dragon Canoe and other young men there at the council persuaded the chiefs to fight, that this was the time to join with the Ohio Valley Confederacy and fight. In the summer of 1776, there were Cherokee raids on the westernmost settlements coming out of North Carolina and Georgia. But the timing was bad. Militia had formed and were ready to fight Britain in Georgia and Virginia and the Carolinas. But the British weren't there. The British had not successfully invaded the South yet. And so those militiamen instead marched on Cherokee country in the summer and fall of 1776. They burned towns, they burned fields. And so Cherokees eventually agreed to peace with the Americans, but there was no United States for them to make peace with. So they had to negotiate a peace treaty with each state whose militia had invaded. And they ended up giving up, at least giving up claim to more than 5 million acres of these shared hunting lands for the most part. Dragon Canoe and other warriors didn't agree to the peace, though, and they separated from the nation, literally separated and moved a bit farther west and kept fighting. So if we were going to move up to the Ohio Valley now for a moment, as I mentioned, the Shawnees and the Delawares, other peoples of the Ohio Valley, plus Mohawks from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and their Cherokee allies to some extent, attacked British colonial settlements west of the Proclamation Line in Kentucky and Tennessee and western Pennsylvania. And they really succeeded in this war. They drove back almost all of these settlements back east over the Appalachian Mountains. But some Delawares and Shawnees were for neutrality, just as the Cherokee chiefs had been. And there also were sort of a long-standing sort of disputes, conflicts between some of the Delawares and Shawnees and the Mohawks and the Haudenosaunees on the other side. And so there was some reluctance to get involved on the British side because the Haudenosaunee were on the British side. But war itself gradually pushed more and more Shawnees and Delawares to the British side, in part because of American militia's inability to sort of distinguish between enemy Indians and friendly Indians. So, for example, just one example, in 1777, Shawnee Chief Cornstalk, who was neutral in the war, was arguing the Shawnees should not be involved in the war at all. He came to the U.S. Army under a flag of truce and was killed by some of the soldiers. So as a result of several killings like this and clearly conflicting war aims, it became more and more common for Shawnees and others in the Ohio Valley to unite against the Americans. So eventually nearly all Delawares and Shawnees unite against the Americans and fight on the side of the British. So we move south a little bit to the Muskogee Creek Confederacy. This is a confederacy that, as you can see on the map, was in basically what's now Alabama and Western Georgia. They're also on the border of Louisiana. Louisiana, by this point, is Spanish. It became Spanish at the end of the 7 Years' War, the previous big uh, European war that took place to some extent on the continent. The Muskogee Creeks were very powerful, large and powerful at the time of the American Revolution, at least 10,000 people. And the British really needed them on their side to try to take back the South as part of the British Southern strategy in the American Revolution. But as I mentioned before, and it's true for the Muskogee Creeks as well, British officers wanted them to come to battles when they needed them and not come if they were trying to make peace, and definitely not attack any settlements of people that might be loyalists, right? That the British might be able to persuade to stay loyal to the crown or return to the fold. Muskogee Creeks who wanted to fight, though, they wanted to fight illegal settlements. They wanted to attack settlements that were illegally on Muskogee land. Muskogee Creeks figured, as one leader put it in 1776, "I have sat quietly a long time without joining either party, but the Virginians are now come very near my nation, and I do not want them to come any nearer." Right? That's the war aim. Spain enters the war against Britain, and so the and started winning some battles against Britain on the lower Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast, including Mobile, Pensacola. And the idea of fighting against Spain for Britain, which had never been appealing to the Muskogee Creeks, got less and less appealing as it looked like the Spanish were actually taking territory and becoming more powerful in the region instead of less. So they, like the others, like the others that I mentioned, the Cherokees and the Ohio Valley Confederacy, they will keep fighting even when the war is over, even when the war between Britain and the United States is over. So I'm going to shift and talk about Native communities. This should say Native communities within the 13 colonies now. So we're talking about New England for a moment. New England's Native communities were definitely surrounded by colonists, by colonial settlements. And most of them supported the rebels, and quite a lot of them supported them early and enthusiastically and were fully part of the rebelling parts of the colonies. So, for example, Natick, mission town in Western Massachusetts, was pro-revolution. Crispus Attucks, who was killed at the Boston Massacre, may have been from Natick. Natick men were among the militiamen that came to line the road back from Concord when the British troops returning from Concord were sort of attacked along their way back to Boston, including a man from Natick named Caesar Ferret and his sons John and Thomas. And then the Ferrets were among the militiamen who followed the British Army back to Boston and laid in for a siege around Boston in the days after after Lexington and Concord. At least a dozen other Native men were there as well, probably others that we just don't know about. Because they were part of their local militias, just part of their town militias, not in separate militias for the most part. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, we know there were Mohegans and Pequots, there were Mashpee Wampanoags, there were Nipmunks. And so, as I say, in contrast to a Shawnee force or the Muskogee Creek force or a Cherokee force, these are men who were part of colonial militias, their local town militias, and many of them as individuals enlisted in Washington's Continental Army and fought throughout the war, including Caesar Ferret. Ferret was 60 years old when he joined, but he served throughout the war. At least 26 Mashpee Wampanoag men served, and a large number of men from Stockbridge, which was another mission town, who served together. Similarly, in the South, there were members of Virginia and North Carolina tribes that enlisted individually in the Continental Army and in their local militias, including Pamunkeys. Pamunkeys are the tribe of Pocahontas, right, going back to the 1500s. Occaneechees and Saponis, ancestors of the Lumbees. In all of these places, they're surrounded by colonists who were fed up with taxation, believed that there were opportunities that would serve them better outside of the British Empire as an independent nation. And so did they. They wanted to be part of this new United States, and they were. They were economically similar to many of their white neighbors. They went to the same Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian churches. Um, and then sort of in between, are the Oneida Nation, which was part of the Haudenosaunee, is part of the Haudenosaunee, and the Catawba Nation in South Carolina. They were more independent nations, still making their own foreign policies at the time of the American Revolution. So they have that in common with nations on the border. And yet they were pretty much surrounded by and had these same kinds of family and economic and religious ties with the colonists that I've been talking about with those nations within colonial communities. So both the Oneidas and the Catawbas, for the most part, joined the revolution side of the revolution. They fought alongside Americans, but they fought sort of in their own units, if you will, rather than enlisting as individuals. So if we're going to move to effects on the Revolutionary War and beyond. There are many, at the time of the American Revolution, there are many, many, many more people in the category of independent nations outside the United States than there are Native peoples within the colonies, right, surrounded by the colonists. And so you would think that the advantage there would go to the British, right? If independent nations on the border are more likely to ally with the British should have the advantage in numbers of Native supporters. But it didn't really work out quite as the British had hoped. If it is possible that if all the Native nations that the British had assumed would be on their side, especially those Native nations in the South, if they had joined in the sort of Southern strategy of the British, the way the British expected them to, maybe the revolution would have lost. Maybe the British would have at least retaken the South if the Muskogee Creeks and the Cherokees and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws had completely fought on the side of the British. But that wasn't what they were going to do. They were still in their own nations. That was the point of the fighting, for their own independence, and they were going to attack the kinds of targets that fit with their purposes in joining the American Revolution. They were not going to fight at the beck and call of British officers. So at the end of the war, Native nations still occupied most of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, some 25,000 square miles. It had been land recognized as native by the British in 1763, and of course, prior to that, and as well in later agreements. The Treaty of Paris, though, gave all of that land to the United States. The Treaty of Paris that was signed by the United States and Britain. It was not agreed to by any Native nations. It was not agreed to in those terms by the French or the Spanish. And Native nations on the border didn't accept the terms of the British of the Treaty of Paris. One Muskogee Creek wrote, Britain has no right to give up a country she could never call her own. Britain can't give up land that never was part, that was never controlled by, never really was part of Britain. And so that fighting, those raids that had been happening during the war actually increased in the years right after the American Revolution, from the Ohio Valley south to Georgia. And the large southern nations made treaties with the Spanish. The Spanish had actually advanced during the American Revolution, had moved even closer to what had been the British colonies. It was now the United States. And the Spanish made treaties with Native nations that really explicitly agreed to terms that Native nations set of this land belonging to Native nations, that they were just making a pact of mutual alliance and protection with the Spanish, not agreeing that Spain owned their land. So, for example, the wording of the treaty that the Muskogee Creeks made with Spain said that the free nation of Muskogee Creek, so explicitly in Spanish, right, says the free nation of Muskogee Creeks, expect His Majesty to protect them against the intentions of those who believe they have a sovereign right in the villages. So the United States is claiming Muskogee Creek lands. The Spanish negotiators pledged, though, that the generous mind of His Most Catholic Majesty is far from exacting lands from the Indians. So these treaties between Spain and Muskogee Creeks, as well as the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and some of the Cherokees, they explicitly say that Spain will help them protect their land, is not there to take their land. So the war on the border doesn't end when the American Revolution ended. Spain and also Britain provide munitions, gunpowder, musket balls for this continuing fight by Native nations on the United States. And then the contests over the whole western two-thirds of the continent will continue well into the 19th century, into the late 19th century. In the East, in contrast, though, Native communities would use their service in the Revolution to, in some cases, get land grants as veterans, and in some cases, the right to vote, because they had proved themselves part of winning the independence of the United States. So I'll just close with 2 points. First of all, the Revolution was an international war, and many of the nations that were involved were Native nations, right? Nations, independent nations making their own foreign policy. And second, there were a variety of ways in which Native people experienced the war, reacted to the war. So in these generalized ways I've just said, but also variation within those categories as well. Those are my 2 main points for my lecture. Let me just make one third point that goes a little beyond that, and that is that Native nations were not destroyed by the American Revolution. There will be hard times to come, obviously, in the 19th century with US expansion. But they weren't destroyed by the revolution or by anything since. Many losses, but they found ways to survive the creation and the expansion of the United States. Oops.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. So super helpful, as always, and completely absorbing. I've got a couple of questions. I'm wondering if you can help me think through a couple of things. Um, one is one of the stories sometimes we tell about Indigenous people over the 18th century, from the late 17th century forward with those wars of empire, is a story of incredible displacement. And I'm wondering, and the Catawba, partly because of Jim Merrill's work and other things, Catawba end up being a kind of like a focus for that story of migration, and the complexity of being pushed around in different ways. But the maps you show us really give us a sense of just how many nations we're talking about here, and also the the spatial relations. To what extent is that picture of migration, the, being pushed around in the context of being involved with or being affected by those wars of empire, a factor by the time of the revolution?
So, as you know, so much has happened on the East Coast by the time, so we're sort of separated that way. So much has happened on the East Coast by the time of the American Revolution, right? The Pamunkeys in Virginia have had a reservation since the mid 1600s. And so I think that distinction between people who have definitely been pushed around and hemmed in, and yet by the time of the American Revolution, have figured out ways, or definitely still figuring out ways of holding on to that land, holding on to some land, right? Not the land that they started with, is a really important, I think, lesson to thing to remember about U.S. history, because it helps us not make. Let me just say, and then the independent nations that I've been talking about, almost all of them are removed at the time of Indian removal, if not before, right? So talk about being pushed around. They are literally pushed out of the East, of their homelands into what's now Oklahoma and Kansas. And so that distinction continues, that the smaller peoples who are surrounded by colonists by the time of the American Revolution, they almost all stay in the East. They've found ways to embed land ownership into ways in which the courts understand land. They've put some land into private ownership, even though it may still be used as communal land. They have integrated themselves in sort of ways of employment and church with their neighbors. And so I think sometimes when we tell big stories, like it doesn't sound like the simplest one to say, the simpler one to tell is the one of U.S. expansion and removal.
Yes.
And yet there are also all these stories there are these real histories of Native peoples who are still in the East, and this is why.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. And a related one is because I guess I'm thinking about all the ways which your work in particular, but also other recent work has helped us really kind of tell this story of the 18th century so differently. And I guess I'm just like calling back to ways we used to tell this.
Uh-huh.
But like here's another one, which is how do we think about the ways that conflict in and among Native nations was happening around the period of the revolution and how consequential that was by comparison with conflict with or alliance building with the British or the, whatever, the Massachusetts or Virginia,
Right,
or
right.
whether we
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
call them all
exactly.
settlers or we want to distinguish them. Do you know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah, exactly. And it's so important. And yeah, I only barely alluded to this sort of the Haudenosaunee versus Delaware ideas about who
Mm,
should be on whose side, but it is deeply important and old and not done with, right? Now, there are prophets from Pontiac going forward who say we got to stop all of that. Like the British colonies and then the United States, as Tecumseh and others will say, that is a threat unlike any we've ever faced before. And we have to drop our old wars and conflicts. We have to, Tecumseh even says we need to imagine a future in which we are all the same. We are all Native Americans.
mm,
We shed being Shawnees or anything separate. Um, but that doesn't really work. That's not the way
mm.
most Native people see themselves. They see themselves as belonging to their own, families and towns and nations and confederacies that have, like all people's, histories where they are, and some of that history is of conflict with other Native nations. And then there's this sort of, I think you could almost see it moving west of like Native people saying, okay, maybe it is right that we do need to all join together. And maybe the Shawnees start to move toward that. And then some of them will go west and try to convince Western people of that. And Western Native people are like, that doesn't make any sense. Like we're all different from one another. And so you almost see that sort of the idea of Native American as a race, if you will, if you want to go that
Mm,
far, sounding ridiculous. Because of course, when you describe racialism, it is ridiculous, right?
yeah,
Unless you're living in the history that has come to believe that race is true. Um, and so, but then as the US moves west and is a greater threat than perhaps has ever been there, people start to come along. And I think that's why, today there, Native people do see themselves as Native Americans in addition to whatever their particular Native citizenship is.
yeah, yeah. I thought it's such an interesting and important point about identity, about Native American identity, Native Nation membership, and U.S.
Yeah.
citizenship. Like these things all happening at the same time, and some of that,
Right.
and there are certain kinds of claims, identity
Yeah.
claims, and pieces there. Okay, another thing I wanted to ask you about is the importance of treaties as a form of government, because this is obviously really, your point about, that great quote about like Britain has no right to give up land like that
Yeah.
isn't hers. And the Europeans have been doing that for hundreds of years by
Yeah.
that point. They've been
Yeah.
coming in and claiming and, making arrangements around that.
Mhm.
But then the US then immediately kind of tries to step in and start making treaties
Yeah. Right.
with nations. So, how does the US act vis-a-vis treaty making with Native Americans in the immediate post-revolutionary era in ways that help us see their nationhood, basically?
Yeah, yeah, right. I think just the most important, yeah, like the first thing to say is that in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, Native nations are foreign governments, right? And so Native interactions with Native nations is diplomacy, and it falls
Yeah.
under many of the same sort of categories as the emerging diplomacy with France or with Spain or with Britain. Um, and so, you don't make a treaty with somebody who isn't sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the United States thinks I mean, it has won. The United States wins the
Mm-hmm.
American Revolution. And so early diplomats go across the Appalachians and try to make treaties with Native nations as a victor. So
Mm-hmm.
saying you're going to have to cede this land. And pretty quickly it becomes clear, maybe should have been clear from the beginning, that the United States cannot under the Articles of Confederation, certainly
Mm.
afford to fight all of these wars, and that the wars, as I said, are not over. Those nations are still fighting harder than ever, if possible, against the United States once the United States has defeated Britain. And
Yeah.
so the pretty quickly, including in the Washington administration, the United States has to literally start choosing its battles, and so it commits to a fight in the Ohio Valley, one of the places that Virginians and others think is most important to get land in. But it makes peace with those southern tribes that have allied with Spain, sort of deciding
Mm.
not to fight there. And so the wars in the South really end against the Muskogee Creeks and others with these treaties that are pretty favorable to them. I mean, really, I
Mm.
mean, I should say they get what they want out of these new treaties with the United States. They get peace and they don't lose any land. The Cherokee one is different because it's the beginning of the war. It's in 1776 or so. But the post-war treaties really just make peace in the South without the United States getting the border that it claims to have over those Native nations. That will change
Yeah.
in the 19th century, right? But for the late 18th century and the first couple decades of the 19th century, Native nations are, the treaties confirm
Mm.
their nationhood and their sovereignty in their homelands.
Thank you. I'm going to encourage folks to add questions. Let me start with one question here from Adam. Is there a story, I love this, of a person or event from this period that has stayed with you the most?
Yeah, there's so many. There's so many. I think one of the stories I often tell is of Alexander MacGillivray, who was a Muskogee Creek.
Mm.
He is his name is Scottish. Obviously, his father was Scottish, but the Muskogee Creeks are matrilineal, so he was also fully Creek. Had a clan within the Muskogees, and I think when he's young, he thinks he will be a merchant like his dad. He'll be a trader, his dad, and
Mm.
so he grows up in part in his mom's country in Muskogee Creek country, but he also spends time in Georgia and the Carolinas, training under his father to become an importer to import goods to trade to the Muskogee Creeks and export deer hides and other products. But then the revolution breaks out, and his father is Scottish. He's a loyalist. He gets expelled from the colonies, sent back to Scotland. And so Alexander MacGillivray and his sister Sophie they get on a horse and they ride back to Creek Country, which is a long way away. And he becomes a leader I think in part because he thinks that fighting the colonists is the best thing for the Muskogee Creeks, in part because he's still angry about how his father was treated by the rebels, and in part because he's a young man who would like to be he has ambitions for himself. He becomes a strong advocate of the Muskogee Creeks fighting against the United States, and even fighting against Spain, and just wholeheartedly siding with the British.
Mm.
And then after the war, he negotiates. He's one of the negotiators. He's probably the main negotiator of the treaty with Spain. He tries to create then, talking about uniting and getting rid of ending old native wars. He tries to create a Southern Confederacy, not the the Civil War Confederacy, but a native
That one.
Confederacy, not that Confederacy, right? But a native Confederacy that will parallel the Ohio Valley Confederacy. And he tries to bring in the Chickasaws and his own people, the Muskogee Creeks, the Cherokees, and the Choctaws. But he says and he's literate. He writes letters, so he's a rare 18th century sort of Native American whose own writing we can read. He says the Muskogee Creeks are in charge of this Confederacy, and maybe he is in charge of the Confederacy. And the Chickasaws and others will have not. They're like, you are not in charge of us, young man. And they completely don't. He rides in at one point with a bunch of warriors and into the Chickasaw Nation to punish them for something they've done. They've allowed in some American traders who are coming in with goods, and he thinks the Confederacy has agreed not to do that, and so he comes in and he actually kills some Chickasaws, and the Chickasaws are like this. They think this is ridiculous, and it does not work at all. And then he ends up being the main negotiator for one of these treaties with the United States, even though he's been fighting the United States. One of these, this treaty with the between the United States and the Muskogee Creeks
Mm,
that really confirms the borders of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So I think one of the reasons that he's fascinating is just because we can read his own writing. He talks about
mm,
reading newspapers that came in. He keeps very much up with news from Europe, and he's really a reminder that many Native leaders were men of the world. They were sort of
mm,
envisioning a 19th century where their nations would not only continue as they had in the past, but would be, on the same sort of world stage as the United States. That they
mm.
would be modern 19th century nations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow. Um, okay, I've got a couple of other, I have more questions too, but I'm going to let our guests ask questions here. A question here. I was hoping you could dive into the Spanish and Indian nations relations a bit more. Were the Spanish signing a lot of treaties at this time? Was that by order of the crown or more on the ground decisions? And did they call in favors to former alliances with Spain to help them resist later?
Yeah.
I think that's super obviously important when I'm wondering if you can wrap that into the revolution, in the context of Florida, maybe. I don't know.
Yes, yes, exactly. So Spain fights against Britain in the American Revolution, as I said. Spain really wants to take advantage of this rebellion and seize more territory, and it wins. So by the end of the American Revolution, Spain has seized all the lands along the Gulf Coast, as far as Pensacola. So it has Louisiana, and then now sort of what the British had called West Florida. So what's now, under the Spanish Empire. Obviously, the Muskogee Creeks don't see it quite this way, but Alabama, Mississippi, the Florida Panhandle, they get the Florida Peninsula back. They're like Spain is, and Spain's claims go even farther. And so Spain basically claims all the lands except the Atlantic coast, which the
Mhm.
United States obviously doesn't agree with. And so for a while, these alliances are tremendously important for Native nations in the region. Now, I think it's important not to think of Spain as, acting in the interest of Native nations. It's acting in Spanish interest. Those treaties are partly because the Spanish Empire is ridiculously spread out at this point. From Tierra del
Mm,
Fuego till to Western Georgia, and as far up as the Great Lakes, and at least in their view of things. And so they need Native nations. They need the only way they're going to sort of assert their sovereignty is by piggybacking on real Native sovereignty in these regions. And then as time moves forward, so they support, they don't go to war with the United States. Spain doesn't. So the support is secret, but they give not so secret assistance to the Muskogee Creeks and others as they fight the United States. But then the French Revolution breaks out. There are Latin American independence movements that Spain has to deal with. Napoleon then comes to power in France and really takes over the Spanish crown. The Spanish sort of stop being able to make their own foreign policy for a little while, and end up being a considerably less powerful ally than they had looked in 1783, just to
mm.
tell a long story short.
No, it's so interesting, and it really helps just to highlight this exact point you've been making about that. Thinking about all the complex relationships here, and there are so many more relationships on the Native nation side than there are, in fact, on the European side. There's like a
Even
handful
more.
of Europeans, and there's a lot more, right, complexity, and a lot more
Yeah.
players to make decisions, a lot more decision making,
Yeah,
complex
right,
decision
right,
making.
right. Because
Really,
there's, people within nations don't always agree with one another. Yeah.
yeah, so interesting. Okay, this is a question asks if you're willing to consider a counterfactual.
Okay.
What do you think would have happened to indigenous land ownership west of the 1763 line if the British had won? Like, what would have
Yeah.
happened to that post
Yeah.
7 Years' War settlement
Yeah.
if the Americans hadn't triumphed, as it were? How long could they have maintained that line? Well, they weren't really holding the line anyway, but
The line was
but
was
yeah,
was was
yeah,
had a lot of loopholes in it.
yeah.
But the I think longer, right? That's not
Mm,
very specific.
mm,
But there I do think imperial officials see sort of things on the ground differently from the way settlers and
mm,
speculators see them, and they do see sort of keeping the peace as important, and also they see uh, they see them all sort of as British subjects, in different ways with different kinds of rights and privileges, but they do see Native nations as having rights with, I don't know if rights is quite the right word, but having a position, a continuing position within the British Empire. Now, the US government at various points wants to keep settlers in line and makes treaties and promises and even sometimes removes settlers from the United States from native land after a treaty, and the US government isn't able to keep its people in line either. Now, as a republic, it has different obligations to its people than an empire has. But I yeah, the growing that just the crazy increase in population that the British colonies have, if that kept on, I think it would have been hard to keep them in line for much longer, maybe a couple extra generations, which not that that wouldn't matter. But on the other hand, here's another counterfactual. The British let and encourage the colonies to industrialize, and they aren't a nation of farmers anymore, and they don't move west. Yeah, maybe that's totally different. Right?
Mm.
But that's,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, David. That was an interesting question to get us thinking about. This is actually a related one, related to the kind of paper fence of 1763, is a question about George Washington and Washington's relationship to Native nations throughout his career, first in serving the empire and then in serving the new nation. Um, Obviously, he has a complex set of investments there, literal
yeah,
investments.
that's right. That's right.
And anyway, I'll just leave it there. What do we
Yeah.
think about how Washington is relates to that, the proclamation line of
Yeah.
1763 and
Yeah.
Western
Right. Yeah. Colin
lands?
Calloway has a terrific book about George Washington throughout his career and Indians. And so George Washington says to his land agent, let's ignore the proclamation of 1763. And so he's like, it's not going to stand. Let's keep doing the things we're doing to eventually speculate on these Western lands. He's confident that, I mean, in one way, he's confident that there will be a way to get those lands. In another way, it is, for him and other Virginians that the resistance, even if it's not very effective, of the British
Mm.
government to speculation and settlement in the West is one of the frustrations they have with the British Empire. Then, of course, when he's president, he's a little bit in the, he can work on behalf of speculators and settlers, but he also is in the position of being in charge of a nation that can't, keep up all these wars in the West. So he does then also express frustration with settlers who violate treaties. So he is, as in all things, complicated and interesting, and part of the good and the bad and the in between of American history.
So many places is George Washington. Um, do you think that, I mean, the principal point, you wanted to share with us a kind of a couple of key points here, and one of the points was just the complexity of Native nations and of these incredible number of sovereign nations during the period of the revolution. And what happens after the revolution? Do you feel like the kind of flattening out into just like Indian policy? How fast does that happen? Does it actually ever happen? Do you never get to a point of like Indian policy, even though they talk about like Indian
Yeah,
policy?
yeah, that's a great question, and I I think, yeah, I probably would take the opportunity to say it never quite happens, right? There is just a continual desire to, okay, the policy is going to be assimilation, or we're
Mm,
going to make Native we're going to make Native men into citizens of the United States, or the policy is going to be, okay, they're not going to assimilate quite yet, but in a couple generations they will. So in the meantime, they should give up their hunting lands, and men should stop hunting and they should start farming. Women should stop farming and they should move into the household and spin and weave, and that's the Indian policy. Or eventually, the Indian policy is removal because they aren't assimilating and they have to live somewhere else. They can't live among us. But there are always holes and exceptions in this, and there are always ways in which there are some ways in which Native people fight back, and also just somehow survive through these different eras. I don't know. I didn't. I took the hedging way out, but
It's just really interesting to
yeah,
think about. So I have one more question for you, and then we have another excellent
yeah,
historiographical question here in the chat box. It's about veterans' pension records, because you mentioned this
yeah,
question about
yeah,
the complexity of different positions during the actual war,
yeah.
that is, fighting in their own organized, in their own national interests, fighting in alliance with loyalists, fighting in alliance with the patriots, the Americans, and then fighting actually incorporated with
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Americans. And
yeah,
that's, I'm assuming, where we see those pension records. And
right.
I'm wondering how, like, how much do you find those records like revealing? And anyway,
Yeah.
can you talk about those?
Oh, they are amazing. So these are pension, for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more about these than I do, but for the most part, filed in the 19th century. Yeah, in the
Mm,
19th century, some as late as the
mm,
1830s and such,
mm,
right? By veterans who by this point are elderly, sometimes by
mm,
their widows because they are no longer
mm,
alive. And to get a pension, you have to tell your story, right? Tell where you
mm,
were, tell why you signed up, maybe a little bit, and what battles you fought in and such. And at least sometimes they will say, I'm Pamunkey, or I came from the Indian town of such and such. And one of the things that and they really can show how, both, men who both clearly identified themselves as Indian or belonging to a particular tribe, but also joined up for reasons that really parallel what their sort of non-Indian neighbors were joining up for. And one of the things I've been seeing going on in North Carolina a lot, and I'm sure it's going on in other places, is Native people today doing their own ancestry work and looking at pension applications, as well as all kinds of other family records and things like that. And so it seems like just constantly I'm running into somebody in North Carolina who's found another ancestor who, a Native person today who's found an ancestor who fought for the Continental Army or something like that. So it's just
mhm,
those pension records continue to be sort of sources of new findings for both, family members as well as historians. And yeah, they're just
mhm.
amazing.
Yeah, it's really rich stuff. So Adam asked this great historiographical question. So wonderful. What areas of Native American history need more historical treatment?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as you know, there's so much complexity. There's so much still to write about. I think sort of I mean, I'm interested in kind of the everyday lives of people who stayed in the homelands of their distant ancestors and how they managed that. I had a grad student who recently published her book, Brooke Bauer, writing about how Catawbas found a variety of ways of putting land in a woman's name and other things just to hold on, sort of counterintuitive things, not the way you think would be the way to hold on to property in the
Mm,
18th and 19th century. But I think there are just so many small stories of um, kind of moving through these decades and centuries of history that we tend to generalize about. And then I would just say the
mm,
West is still wide open.
mm,
There's some good work, but just so much left to know about California and the Pacific Northwest.
mm.
Yeah, I think, yeah, lots and lots of things.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Yeah,
Such a pleasure as always. Really
thank you.
just terrific to talk with you. Thank you for spending time with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Karen.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.